So welcome everyone to this deep dive session, which is entitled Outcomes Are Knotty for Public Procurement. And I think what this session is designed to do is to get us to reflect on some of the procurement process questions that are thrown up by an attempt to do things on an outcomes basis. And by procurement process, I don't just mean the sort of competitive tendering award stage, but the whole process from beginning to end. So market development right through to monitoring, enforcement, reporting, and all of those questions in between those stages. So we're looking at the full range of the procurement process and what sorts of issues arise there from the perspective of outcomes-based contracting. We've put together a fantastic panel with experience in different kinds of outcomes-based procurement in different countries, different sectors. And what I'm hoping is that we'll be able to draw out some distinctive insights from those countries and sectors, and also some common shared experiences about the challenges of outcomes-based procurement. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, who is Professor Nadia Parekh from Sonoma State University in the US. Nadia's online for us, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm trying to share my screen and then start. Are you able to see my slides?
Yes, we are. Yeah.
Okay. So I want to be mindful of the time. So as our chair introduced, I'm from California in Sonoma State University. My name is Nadia Parekh, and I'm specifically speaking about a social issue, which is an age-old problem in the United States, and especially in California, about homelessness and how the US government has been approaching it in a one-sided way. And do we need more diversity in our approaches of government procurement and outcome-based models? So that's basically what I'm trying to discuss with you all. And as we know from literature, everybody being a problem like homelessness, being a wicked social problem, classic example, has divergent views based on how they frame this problem. And as I mentioned, the US government, right from the George Bush time to the Joe Biden phase, we are for housing first. And no matter the fact that we all know that it is definitely a step needed, and no denial that we need more housing. However, we see over bias on an extreme focus only on one approach, which is a highly capital intensive one and specifically meant for only certain segments and not for all, right? And it takes a lot of time and resources to ensure that that outcome comes and it is achieved and stable. So a survey of all the impact outcome-based contracts in this space in the United States is what I began with. And as you can see here, I don't want to read out each one of them other than the one which I've just highlighted in red, the Salt Lake one. Other than that, which we have experimented beyond the housing first with behavioral and employment counseling, most of it was achieving numbers to just make sure that, as much as it's a big effort, that a segment of people are housed and they are trying to be stable within, and they are being evaluated within that space. But there is no clear evidence that whether this was enough or in terms of why this was only a one-sided approach. So when I looked at interviews with and spoke with the social finance organization, which generally structures and designs outcome-based contracts with the government, their view on this topic was that the predominant focus was only on the chronically homeless, because of the fact that they are the ones, based on their vulnerability, who takes a lot of public expenditure in terms of medical and juvenile health, justice system. And therefore, even though there are other segments like the youth, and for them employment could be an option, it has not been explored enough. So as you can see in the statistics, chronically homeless, definitely it's a segment, but there are other segments which are yet to be served effectively by the government initiators. And we have a huge statistics of people who are on the verge or at risk of homelessness, which again, based on public procurement models, can be addressed through a non-housing kind of housing first approach, maybe with an eventual help for housing, but at the same time with employment first. So the fact that there are other factors like mental health, relationships, and economic and employment aspect being neglected is a concern, especially for people who feel like, what are we doing? Just taking people without, treatment first, and then just moving from street to rooms, and then not really helping them to participate in the economy through an employment-oriented way. And again, experiences in California shows that the housing first is impacting the taxpayers' money on a higher end, because every house, or the permanent shelters cost close to $750 and $1,000, and it is not a small sum. Especially when we look at the debate, we know that a lot of experiments in California shows that mistargeting, like in order to house one person, you need to actually give 10 people, out of which all of may not be really deserving to be part of the permanent housing. So a lot of mistargeting happens, and it is a highly cost incentive way to do about it, especially in a place like California, where there is issues with land and climate change and employment in general. So the rhetoric has been changed to, we need to create, at least from the academic and research side, safety net debates rather than homelessness being addressed through only one approach. So is this lack of diversity in the government approach itself a problem, is what I want to highlight here, because there is a lot of solutions on the root cause that is not yet explored, and probably good for segments other than people who are, in the emergency state of chronically, homeless in that segment. So why wait until then, when we can actually look at segments with other approaches, especially by social entrepreneurs? We know that there's a lot of effort that have been on the employment side. So when I look at this question, we definitely see from California experience that we have mixed results, mistargeting, and counterproductive initiatives. And just like the pandemic seems to have told us, like, I can join this conference virtually in hybrid mode, we also have that in the business world, possibility to work remotely. So isn't this a time to explore mixed approaches? So in the UK, research shows that there's, as you can see here, a lot of social enterprise efforts on the employment side. So in the US as well, there are some examples here which builds upon giving employment-based solutions to this segment. These are some examples which, if anyone wants to go over the slides, you can see. They are building small, but at the same time do not have the public support or in terms of the government funding. So what if we can design models beyond, or non, in the sense, even though housing can be, the goal, still the goal at the end, start off with corporates and social enterprises, which can train the homeless who are able to step in that direction. And government can incentivize the corporates who fund that and also actually employ these people, so that there is an incentive for, the social side of what the corporates do, not just in the money side, but also the employment. And the government can really see the impact that they are creating pathways for housing, which is more stable. So that's the case for, thinking beyond housing first that I was discussing, because we know that in the US, there is a huge segment who is at risk of homelessness and who are mostly less than 50 years. So they are currently being underserved the way, most of the contracts are. And if you look at, the whole discussion of what I was just mentioning about the wicked problem, it generally benefits not just from one, but diverse solution, because there's no end solution. So even if maybe there are a lot of opponents for employment or treatment-based approaches, it's worth experimenting to see how the outcomes of it are and compare it vis-a-vis the existing ones. Because the current ones, as you can see, it is mostly focused at only the chronically homeless population, which is an emergency response that is needed, highly capital intensive, but the preventive side and the aspect that there is a lot of people who can benefit from employment has not yet been explored. And I know that to a large extent, this is not the case in the UK or other places who have started off with some experiments on Pathfinder model. So that is something that I wanted to highlight and say that maybe one of the solutions to see if the government can explore more social value in this space is to change the nomenclature of this issue of homelessness, because a homeless has multiple issues which are contributing to their state or their phase in life, and identifying what is the root cause for different segments who are experiencing this and creating activities and contracts around that can be a better way to see if we are having outcomes which are resulting in stable housing. So that's the thought that I wanted to discuss, and over to the board, over to all of you who are there or joining online for any questions at this point, or maybe as the chair can say, maybe at the end.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Nadia. That was great and set a brilliant example in terms of keeping to time. So well done for starting us off on a brilliant footing. So what we're going to do is hear from the rest of our panelists, and then we'll collect up some questions for all of our speakers and give you all an opportunity to respond to the most exciting of those questions towards the end. So we'll be back to you once we've heard from everyone else. Thank you very much, Nadia, for your presentation.
Thank you.
So our second speaker is here with us in the room, Felipe Roa-Clavillo, who is from Andes University and is going to be talking about food procurement in Colombia. Felipe.
Right, thank you very much. Let's see if this works. I think it should work. Right, thank you very much for the invitation, for the opportunity of being here. Actually graduated from this university 3 years ago, so it's great to be back in post-pandemic time. And I work at the School of Government of Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, and I'm working in this paper with my colleague. Sorry, I just blanked. Marco Rodriguez Sassoni, who is from the FAO office in Bogota, and who's actually been working on this food public procurement law in Colombia. Let's see if this works. I think this is working. So yeah, I'll just say next. I just want to start off by saying that public procurement of food in Colombia is very much a story about doubling the efforts to address rural poverty, to address food insecurity, and to address high levels of inequality, both in the cities and in rural areas. Most of the poor people in Colombia live in the countryside. Most of them are the ones who produce our food. So it's the equation is turned the other way around. Those who are producing food for the cities are those who are the poorest of the poor. And at the same time, food insecurity for children under 5, it's also at very high levels. Only this year, 39 children under 5 have died because of illnesses related to malnutrition. Next, please. So the question we've been working on is how can government collaborate with family farmers to create inclusive markets for marginalized small farmers, to invigorate local economies, including employment, incomes, and innovation. How can these partnerships improve nutrition for beneficiaries of these social programs? How can these partnerships support local supply with local producers and transparency mechanisms as well? If we go to the next one, please. And so to understand this question, it is important to visit the legislative background. Colombia, in terms of food procurement oriented to family farming, is at a very early stage. Next, please. And this very early stage has to do with a law that was just came out 2 years ago during the first months of the pandemic, and it requests all government agencies to purchase food either for consumption, such as military bases, hospitals, prisons, or that distribute food such as school feeding programs to buy a minimum of 30% to smallholders. And this is something that is very new, something that is very, very positive. It solves one of the problems for smallholders, which is markets, because they didn't have a market before. But now it has opened new markets, but at the same time, it opens new problems, which in my view are good problems to have. Next, please. And so this law requires also to create a task force, which is at a very early stage in Colombia, that is putting together both the institutional entities or agencies from the government who are demanding food, such as the Ministry of Education and its school feeding program, such as the police and their military and the police bases, the military bases, etc. And it requests that they should be sitting at this task force or this round table with the institutions and agencies who are on the other side of the food demand. So that means they have to be sitting at the same table with the Ministry of Agriculture, with the Rural Development Agency, amongst others. Next, please. And so in terms of the landscape that we have in terms of public procurement, only 3 programs, and this is our very preliminary analysis, because one of the issues is there's not enough information in any of this, but we know that just these 3 programs, the school feeding program, the Family Welfare Institute, and the correctional or the penal system that puts together all the prisons of the country, spend $1 billion per year, which is a significant amount. And there are other potential institutional markets, including the armed forces, the hospitals, elderly care homes, among others. So it's an important market that has never been oriented to this before. Next. And in terms of where is food coming from for these programs, we see most of the food is being purchased to large retailers. They have the majority of that cake, and family farming on the other side. That 3% that we see there is a very small amount. So there's space for growing that percentages and for growing that participation in the market. Next. In terms of where is food coming from, this preliminary analysis also shows that most of the food is coming from outside the municipality. It's not coming from, it's not being locally sourced, even though more or less a third is local supply, but there's also room for expansion. Next. And so some of the challenges that we've identified so far in terms of this new regulation is the data and capacity of smallholders to produce enough quantity with enough quality and with food safety. They have not received or developed enough technical assistance in the previous years. So those are important challenges that have to be addressed, including where is food coming from and how often will it be provided. But also challenges in terms of infrastructure, in terms of productive infrastructure, but also in terms of transport. The rural roads in Colombia, most of them are in a very bad state. So that's one of the other challenges. And then we can't leave out the question of sustainability because, well, Colombia is the second most biodiverse country in the world, but it seems that we have forgotten that when it comes to agriculture, because the agriculture is expanding and agriculture and cattle raising are the 2 economic activities that drive more biodiversity loss in Colombia. So that can't be out of the equation. Next. So I brought this example of the department of Willam. When I said department, I mean a state that has 39 municipalities. They have taken the lead. The governor of this department has taken the lead. They had put together a task force for public procurement of food. Let me see how I'm doing on time. Okay, yeah, 1.5. Yeah, so they've put together a task force for public procurement, and they've sat together with the Economics and Finance Department, with the Secretary of Agriculture, and they've prioritized for their school feeding program local produce, and they have engaged so far almost 2,000 farmers in this effort, and they've also prioritizing value chains, including rice and beans, which is like a very, very important product for the area. They are also very ambitious in terms of they don't want to go only for that 30%. They are aiming for 50%, and so that's basically also a good example of leadership and commitment to this endeavor. Next. And so, yeah, maybe I'm gonna skip this one. Well, I mean, this is just a summary of the steps we have identified for what's next in terms of public procurement. So it's important to estimate the demand, but also the supply, because there's not enough information about that, the importance of technical assistance and coordination. Next. FAO has been producing very important materials, reports, guidelines, among others, and they are being so far used, but you know, the effort needs to continue here. Next. And so just to close here and just to connect to the panel's name, outcomes are knotty for public procurement. I want to say, yes, they are very knotty for public procurement in Colombia, but with good coordination and with the exchanges that we're having here, I hope this can move forward and this will have better results in the near future. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Felipe, especially for that last slide, which I think is a work of genius. Wonderful. So again, please store up your questions and thoughts and comments, because there'll be an opportunity to ask those when we've heard from the rest of the panelists. So we move on now to Elizabeth Newman-Earle, who is from E50K Consultancy and who is going to be talking about service provision for armed forces families in the UK.
Thank you very much. Are you okay to do the slides? Perfect. It can't be done here. Challenging and changing service provision for armed forces families. What springs to mind when you think about the armed forces? Ceremonial duties at key public events, serving and protecting our national sovereignty by brave men and women. What is probably not frequently considered is a restrictive environment that exists behind the wire and across the national housing estate of our service families. This culminates in the oft-repeated phrase of, "It can't be done here," being heard across military establishments and is pretty much the standard refrain towards developing innovative ideas to improve the social outcomes of the armed forces community. For outsiders, the question is often why. Why would you need to improve the lived experience? There is subsidised housing, a welfare system to support spouses and partners. You get military discounts, and well, really, there is nothing to complain about. For those living inside the confined armed forces community, however, life is constructed within a hierarchical framework, removing agency and historically curtailing any opportunity for challenging the predetermined norms of everyday life, let alone any form of innovation towards improving the lived experience. Spouses and partners trying to establish new opportunities for community enterprise are frequently stonewalled by the chain of command and are repeatedly informed, "You're just a wife. You won't be here long enough to see it through," due to the frequent mobility of large proportions of the British military. This can create a stifling environment which lacks the vision to see beyond the immediacy of positioning or tenure into possible positive impacts derived by the whole community. The procurement of services under the Future Defence Infrastructure Services, or FDIS, contracts issued by the Defence Infrastructure Organisation, you'll hear quite a few acronyms, so bear with me today, or the DIO, in 2020, created a glimmer of hope for place-based innovation for those directly impacted by the highly restrictive lifestyle. The procurement requirements of response, or RORs, and revised contract terms challenge tenderers to reframe the positioning of the community. This community, for the first time, was brought into sharp focus as valuable participants, not just unknown occupants of an identikit house, which were a necessary evil of a relatively profitable government contract. Whilst the FDIS invitation to tender notice was issued in the months preceding Policy Procurement Notice 0620, or PPN 0620, which aims to deliver social value through government's commercial activities, FDIS contract delivery was designed with this ethos in mind. As stated on the DIO website, the FDIS contracts were developed with service personnel and families firmly in mind. And in developing them, DIO collaborated closely with stakeholders, including service personnel and their families, to ensure that their needs were fully considered. Within FDIS, costed at 640 million over the 7-year term of the contract from 2022 to 2029, as you can tell, I'm not a mathematician, improving the lived experience and delivering social outcomes constituted a significant part of both the RORs and the overall contract delivery model. Opportunity for change was thus, for the first time, allowed to breathe. Examining two specific RORs allow a moment of reflection as to how innovative community social outcomes had the potential to be achieved through the placing of end users centrally within the contract, concurrent to understanding the needs of this specific marginalised community as opposed to purely service delivery. Next slide, please. The supplier shall be responsible for the delivery of services across the affected property to ensure that it is maintained in a safe, legal and operational condition and to enhance the lived experience of occupants of SFAs. SFA, Service Family Accommodation, yet another acronym. We should have done bingo before we started. Next time. The supplier shall identify how the provision of services shall improve the social and economic well-being of service personnel and their families and the wider community. This new consideration of enhancing the lived experience and improving the military and civilian communities was wildly different to the existing 2014 contract, focusing solely on service delivery with no thought for those living within the quarters. Demonstrable innovation was incorporated at early stages of the procurement process by Amy Defence Services, retaining me as an SME with lived experience. Whilst not only an army wife, my PhD looked specifically at the impact of militarisation on army wives, exploring the considerable multifarious impacts following the forces has on spouses. Therefore, using the qualitative empirical evidence from my fieldwork, the build team, in partnership with the operations team, were able to uniquely understand the requirements of the community, which ultimately led to E50K's creation. Established with an initial injection of seed funding from Amy, E50K was formed in 2020 by a group of armed forces spouses and partners with a mandate to refashion the narrative, working to manage a community's perception. Next slide, please. So this is a brief timeline of E50K's activities, demonstrating momentum behind our growth. It's been a busy couple of years with much more happening beside the scenes. So we came up with the idea in 2020. We had confirmation of seed funding in 21. We incorporated as an independent organisation in 2021 as well, May 21. We took over stewardship of an area of the Crown Estate in 21. We incorporated E50K consultancy. We've been developing social value projects within the Defence Estate since winter 2021. We've been building community-based projects since April 22. We've been working on our MEVUM impact since summer 22, and we've also had our Summer of Arts in Bramble Woods, all of which will make sense in a sec. But that gives an indication of what could be achieved through this public procurement. E50K was created to support military communities in identifying relevant place-based projects, co-designed with their local and specific needs in mind. This in itself is a huge challenge to the status quo of the military, who, for as long as there have been wives, determine the areas of access for these wives and spouses and the activities that we can do within the military place-based location. Alongside of identifying these local projects, next slide please, E50K has as its underpinning values engagement, education, employment and enterprise, enabling significant skill development alongside overcoming social isolation whilst creating a network of sustainable projects across the national estate. The following slides showcase in high detail the 3 of the key projects that E50K has delivered since its creation in September 2020. And it is indicative of the scope of opportunity there is to create improved lived experience and social outcomes through a traditional facilities management service delivery contract. Next slide, please. So Bramble Woodlands is a 3.5-acre site in North Yorkshire, and it's absolutely beautiful. It's a multi-generation, or we have determined with the community in mind, it's a multi-generational space. As I'm running out of time, I will quickly whistle through, but we've had £150,000 donated in initial funding, with £31,000 of grants and in-kind donations. So, I mean, it's amazing what we've been able to achieve there. So increased participation in education and employment, improved mental health, well-being, reduced social isolation, and we're planning to expand these types of projects nationally across the estate. Next slide, please. The MEVUM project packs we've been nominated for a Herepreneurs Finalists Award. It's where every arriving SFA occupant or family receives a MEVUM pack, a welcome pack, and we have sourced these from veteran suppliers and ethical and sustainable organisations. So in terms of money, we have paid over £46,000 in the living wage. We've employed 15 spouses on the project. And again, it's demonstrating the improving the social and economic outcomes for military families. Next slide, please. Oh, and Herepreneurs Finalists, we're very proud of this. Next slide, please. And then developing engagement groups with the community as well. So on the civilian world, Residents Association, run-of-the-mill, doesn't happen behind the wire, colloquialism for living within inside a military establishment. And it's the opportunity to give people a voice, which we've never had as a collective before. So yet again, it's about reframing the offering without rocking the senior command too much, which is what I seem to spend my time doing. Thank you. However, to come back to the title of this panel, Outcomes and Knotty for Procurement, the issue we spend a significant amount of time at E50K considering is the codifications of these outcomes and how these become measured by the commissioning clients. Clients themselves must mature in valuing and measuring the outcomes that are achieved on their behalf, and not only through a monetary value. Therefore, the task that must be taken up across all ministries and those working within wider procurement, social value and impact sectors is to consider how to judge outcomes, essentially to consider how value is valued. Next slide, please. So whilst the PPN 0620 has challenged government contractors to consider social outcomes through contract delivery, the derived value must have a metric that speaks both quantitatively and qualitatively while placing the impacted community or end users centrally within its lens. E50K's wider purpose is now to challenge other service delivery models by giving agency to those within communities receiving a service. Such procurement redesign, as seen as in FDIS, has created a template for engaging with vulnerable or voiceless communities through service user market woman engagement, contract co-design and co-production, including objectives, smart outcomes, KPI commitments and impact measurements, thus delivering relevance and purpose for both the place and community itself. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. We move on now to look at the Social Outcomes Contracting in Europe Procurement Guide, which is going to be presented by Rory McDonald from the GoLab and Myra Gramani from the Education Outcomes Fund, formerly of the GoLab.
Thank you very much. My name is Rory McDonald, and I'm here with Myra. We have been working on a guide, the Social Outcomes Contracting in Europe guide. You know social outcomes contracts as SIBs, probably. So we're talking about social outcomes contracting, or SIBs, around Europe. And we're doing this work on behalf of the European Investment Bank, and they're going to be publishing this report on their website. If you go to the next slide, they've got an advisory hub, and this report will be available there. I'm going to summarize just some of the high-level issues that we see in procurement of outcomes. One is related to the parties. So for a lot of procurement officers, dealing with social investors and the social investment community is new. And so that's one of the challenges that we see. Another challenge relates to the actual outcomes themselves and outcome payments. So actually focusing on some point of time in the future is new for a lot of the procurement officers. It's often further in the future, and they're more used to sort of dealing with and thinking about activities and shorter term outputs. We're also looking at challenges related to reporting and data sharing during performance. So we see challenges around who owns the data, and how, to what extent should performance be measured in addition to, in addition to outcomes. And some of these things aren't really clarified at the start, like who's going to share the data. Another issue relates to changes. So some of the narrative around these social impact bonds or outcomes-based contracts are, very much like, let's fix this thing and have fixed prices for it. But we have seen that actually change needs to happen, whether it's in response to COVID-19 or you learn something and nobody benefits, or the service users may not benefit if you realize that actually the services may be improved in some way. So we see people struggling with that and coming up with different solutions. And then challenges related to default and termination. Standard clauses around default and termination allow you sort of to end the project. But what's happening often in these social impact bonds is that a lot of the investment has gone up, it's been put in now, and the actual outcomes and the payments are not going to happen for an extended period. So just freezing things now and paying some kind of termination fee becomes more complicated because the social investor is going to want back their investment in an event of termination. So that can be a challenge, particularly when you sort of try and use regular standard templates. A little bit more on some individual, when you're looking at individual social outcomes contracts. Just 5 quick questions, and then I'm going to hand over to Mara, who's going to talk about like groups of or impact funds, so groups of impact bonds. So the 5 questions are as follows. What functions do you want the awardee to perform? So are you procuring for the actual investment, or are you procuring for the social service, and you're expecting you're expecting that the provider of those social services will go and get funding? And we've seen different approaches, including an approach where one local contracting authority set up a procurement to do both as alternatives, and then decided to go one particular direction. Another question is, or another suggestion is, widen your market engagement to include the social investors as well as the social services providers, to be flexible about how the outcomes are achieved. So instead of just plugging on the outcomes on top of all the activities and regular performance standards and KPIs, think about the outcomes as focusing on the outcomes and allowing more flexibility in the activities. That was a challenge, particularly in for example, Portugal, where there's a lot of sort of requirements around grant spending, and they did their things as grants, and that was very difficult for them to actually then focus on just the outcomes when they're also looking at rules around like how much money was spent on labor versus what are approved expenses. There are real challenges there. And then ensure the contract directly includes a transparency and knowledge sharing requirement. So, we talk a lot about these things being for, we're going to learn, we're going to, share knowledge, but actually, who owns the data and how transparent the whole process will be has been an issue. And then finally, to engage with the beneficiaries and their representatives. So the actual people who are getting the end service users, which I think you were talking about, it's really important to engage with that community as well. Over to you.
Thank you. So hello, everyone. My name is Maira Gramani. I am an associate at the Education Outcomes Fund. But before joining UF, I was a research assistant here at the GoLab and also a student here in the school. So it's really good to be back here. So continuing to talk about our public procurement guide, Rary has mentioned some practical advices for awarding particular social outcomes contracts. And I'm going to focus on when you want to award multiple social outcomes contracts. So I have 5 main advices to mention here. And the first one that we gathered from interviewing different stakeholders in the region is the importance of engaging with legal teams really early in the process. The procurement of social outcomes contracts is different from other types of procurements. So you really need to get the legal teams involved as early as possible, because this can prevent delays later in the process. For example, stakeholders from the Netherlands mentioned this was a key for the success of their awarding process. The second point I want to mention is about deciding on using a contract or using a grant. We saw that there is variety across the countries we've looked to. And so in the UK, Netherlands, Belgium, Finland, and Sweden, for example, the public procurement system is used to award SIBs. But in countries as Portugal and France, they choose to use grants to award the SIBs. This is a choice that will have to be made in some point at the process, and the guide will bring some considerations, some things to take into account when making that decision. My third point is that having a contract template can really facilitate the process of awarding social outcomes contracts, because it can reduce time and costs. So from the countries we've looked at, we saw that the UK and France currently have contract templates. My fourth point is on the importance of transparency, which Rary has already mentioned, but so transparency is really key for knowledge sharing and being able to access materials and documents from different countries is really good for learning and also for scaling those programs to other countries. And we actually, during our research, we had some difficulties in finding these documents, which is why we included this as a very important point to mention. My fifth and last point is that collaboration is key in the process. So do collaborate with other contracting authorities if you are procuring a social outcome contract, because it will make your life easier. It was what we learned from the research.
And we have a couple of people in the room who contributed to the development of this guide. Thomas, I see you there from Sweden. Did you have anything to share?
Hi, everyone. I can just say that how to procure with social outcomes in focus, and maybe we have 2 learnings which I'd be happy to share if you want to know more about. So in one case, we tried to procure with the risk appetite as the main qualification criteria. So we let the bidders decide how much they wanted to have in activities payment related to how much they were willing to have in outcomes payments. So we had a fixed price, and we let them decide between 25% to 75%. outcomes-based. And we thought that would be a way to select those who are believing in their own services, because they should be more willing to take risk. And I think that worked out quite well, actually. So that's one interesting example, I think. The other one is when we did a reserved contract for charities. And we had like a 3-step payment model. So we had activity-based, process outcomes-based, and outcomes-based, which was divided. So 50% was activity-based, 30% process outcomes. So that's like fast outcomes which they can get on short term. And then we have 20%, which was outcomes based on the longer term. So just giving you some ideas on how we try to figure out how to get this risk sharing without, because we haven't done, like in many cases, we have full risk on the investors or providers. We want this skin in the game for every stakeholder. So yeah, just give you a hint on how we have done this in Sweden.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Ruben from the Netherlands. We can hear you. There are great speakers in the ceiling, I think.
I also was a research object, and I think it's a great report. What's interesting also to see in the Netherlands is first we did a lot of procurement, but till 2016 we could easily procure without following the European rules and to have an open European procurement. So that's why in 2016 we had a lot of social impact bonds. So everyone tried to make use of the old rules, and now it's a little bit more difficult, and you have to open up for everyone. Now also the subsidy or grant is used more, and you're allowed to do it through a grant if you're not legally obliged to give a certain service to your constituency. So if it's not a legal task, then you can give a grant. If I look to the procurement phases we went through, indeed, involving the legal team is very important. Because if first time you explain to them, then they're not really happy with it. But then if you talk with them and you also bring in some outside legal experts, you find out there are a lot of opportunities actually, and it's also very important to choose who is procuring who. So we did it once with investors. So we tried to. So investors had to had to try to win the project, and that was really difficult. It didn't fit at all. So procuring an intermediary or maybe even the service provider who then finds investors for the upfront capital is way better. So we're still learning, and maybe one last remark. I think templates are perfect, but unfortunately, I think every country needs its own template because it's quite everyone has its own local flavor.
Thank you very much. And so when this guide is published, which should be soon, you'll hopefully get some of that local flavor from the various countries around Europe that are experimenting and learning here. So thank you very much.
Fantastic, thank you. Great to hear from the researchers and the research subjects. You don't often get that combination together. And so finally, last but not least, moving on to our final speaker, Stephen Chandler, also from the Education Outcomes Fund, talking about financial scoring in outcomes-based procurement. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about financial scoring in outcomes-based procurement, which is a very niche topic. I feel like if I haven't found my audience here, I'll never find them anywhere. So here it goes. So why am I going to be talking about this? So a few months ago, we were doing a procurement through government systems for our outcomes fund in Ghana. It was the first time that this was kind of being done in Ghana through public procurement and an outcomes-based approach. And I realized that significant attention so far has been paid to the design of impact articles outcomes fund, selecting metrics, prices, selecting beneficiaries. On the actual procurement side of it, a lot has been neglected, and specifically on financial scoring. It was one of the things I was thinking, surely something must have been something about. There was a lot of stuff on traditional ground-based procurement processes, but not on outcomes. So why is this important? Because ultimately the provider that you end up choosing will make or break your program. Getting that wrong is very kind of consequential, but then also more importantly, actually, you've got to predefine this scoring system upfront so it's transparent to all bidders, and it's too late to change that process once you're midway at the end of the procurement system. Often price and financial scoring only happens after the kind of quality scoring of a bid, by which point it's too late to kind of change any scores or get a different outcome to what you thought you'd want in terms of a selection process. Next slide, please. So how does financial scoring of bids differ under outcomes-based procurement? And there are three kind of main, or four even, main ways that it differs. Firstly, most importantly, bidders are submitting a price per outcome and not a budget for delivering a service. Now, this sounds very obvious, but actually the implications of this can be quite huge in terms of the way that you score a bid. Having a price per outcome contains within it an implicit assumption on the level of ambition of a bid and the target in terms of the beneficiaries that you want to reach. And you often want to incorporate some degree of which you reward that ambition and reward that scope within your scoring system. The price scoring formulas that are often used under very traditional kind of decades-old procurement systems may not work as intended for outcomes-based processes. Apologies. And finally, it's likely that doing this is going to be one of the first few times that commissioners and providers will have been through this bidding process. And all this is very new. This basically means that providers often don't have experience creating prices per outcome and understanding how to submit prices per outcome, but then also commissioners don't know what prices they should be setting for outcomes, or if they want to leave it open to the market. And this is important because it means that you can often end up with a big range in terms of the prices per outcome that you see submitted if you don't predefine or kind of set some boundaries. Different providers can take very different approaches and get very different results. Next slide, please. I went away and looked at some kind of general procurement price scoring formulas, and without getting into too much detail, essentially scoring falls into roughly three categories. So you've got an absolute scoring mechanism which compares a price against an objective price per outcome that can be set by the commissioner. And a way that you could do that is you say the maximum I'm willing to pay for this beneficiary is say $100, and everyone has to bid at a discount to that, or you match the $100. The other extreme here is kind of relative scoring, where there's no objective price and everything is kind of compared to other bids in the procurement process. The advantage of this is that the commissioner doesn't have to provide a benchmark price. If the commissioner has no idea what the price should be or how much they're willing to pay, you can just leave it open to the market. But it creates a lot of uncertainty for bidders in terms of knowing how well they're going to perform before they've submitted bids. And it creates kind of two weird things that I'm going to talk to you about now, about kind of outcomes that may not be as expected. And then in the middle, you've got price per quality point scoring, which is not one nor the other. You're not comparing prices to other bids, but you're also not comparing it to an absolute price. You're comparing it to its own quality score. This one's less common, but it exists. I'm going to go through a couple of examples of how formulas may not be very intuitive, and how they can kind of give you different outcomes to what you're expecting, even under the same, if you've got the same bids, you use two different formulas, you get very different outcomes. And then I'll finish off with some kind of recommendations. Next slide, please. So as an example, this is a very classic procurement formula where you've got a weighting on quality and a weighting on price. In this case, we've got a 70% weighting on quality and a 30% weighting on price. If we consider the example where there's 3 bidders, and these bidders have a quality score of 60, 57, and 40 out of 70, and then a price of 100, 75, and 50, bidder B gets the maximum total score and wins. Next slide, please. Now, the same bidders, with the introduction of another bidder with a lower price, can change the ranking of the bidders. So bidder A, B, and C here are the same, But with the introduction of a lower price bidder, it changes the ranking of the original bidders. And essentially, this is a kind of slightly counterintuitive outcome where the addition of a new kind of irrelevant bidder with a low quality and a low price score can actually change the composition and the ranking of the other bidders in the group. Why this is super relevant for outcomes-based procurement is because often with prices per outcome, you've got huge different ranges in price per outcome. Often if people are doing this for the first time, they might submit super low price per outcome bids when they don't providers don't have suitable knowledge of the level of ambition or kind of knowledge of how to price outcomes. And it can totally distort your procurement process if you don't have an objective way of scoring bids. Next slide, please. Another kind of disadvantage with relative pricing, relative financial scoring, is it penalizes bids that aren't at either extreme. So it penalizes middle ranking bids. And essentially, if we look at this example here with the same three bidders with a price of $100, $75, and $50 per outcome, the financial score using this formula, which is a super common formula that I've come across in many procurement systems, essentially isn't linear in the same way. So the difference between all of these is 25, but the financial score is not linear. So it penalizes bidder B by more. Bidder B should ideally be exactly between bidder A and C. But because of this kind of relative price scoring, because it's a ratio, the function is not necessarily linear. And a lot of kind of procurement people, like practitioners, don't always understand this immediately. I mean, everyone understands it once they see a few examples, but it's not always super common knowledge. And again, this is really relevant to outcomes-based procurement because, again, you've got a massive kind of range in prices per outcome that you're going to see. And again, the introduction of lower price bids means that kind of the middle rank ends up getting penalized. These are just kind of two examples that I've come across in the paper that I'm writing. There's more examples of counterintuitive outcomes in this type of financial scoring system. And so next slide, please. I'm going to finish with some good practices based on experience and literature for scoring prices in outcomes-based procurement. So start off by engaging the procurement team from the very beginning. I think Maya mentioned that in her presentation. I would say that you should start talking to procurement at the same time that you're going through the design of your impact bond, outcomes fund, whatever kind of outcomes-based contract that you want to procure. Often the mindset of procurement is very different from the mindset of an outcomes-based design. Bringing them along that journey and understanding why you want to have a certain type of scoring system is super important. And often they can understand the rationale behind that if they've been brought along that journey. The second point here is to make sure that your bidders understand your payment function. Again, super important. If bidders don't understand how they're going to get paid, and if it's not clear, they can't price their outcomes correctly, and you end up with very kind of silly bids. The third point here, give clear assumptions where you're setting prices. So if you've got benchmarks, if you're saying that the maximum, if you're a commissioner, the maximum you're willing to pay is $100 per outcome, indicate why that's $100 per outcome and explain the assumptions behind why you've got to that benchmark. The fourth point, pick your scoring formula correctly. There's kind of a lot more formulas than these two that I've got into. Generally avoid formulas that have non-linear functions, as in the second example that I showed. And then the most important thing here is run multiple scenarios with different examples of extreme bids and see how your formula will react to extreme prices. So like come up with 10, 100 different scenarios and see, does the outcome you get from that procurement process match what actually happens? And is there any kind of weird counterintuitive things that may happen that you didn't expect? And then finally, build in a degree of flexibility in pricing during implementation, but specify this upfront. So we all know that things happen in outcomes-based contracts. Sometimes things happen that that may happen that will mean that your prices need to change. You can include that in your procurement process to say, under certain conditions, your prices per outcome will be adjusted by the following formula or the following process. But it's super important to specify this upfront so bidders are clear so that contractually during implementation, it can be a lot smoother than entering kind of long negotiation points during unexpected events. And that brings me to the end.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Maybe a little round of applause for our wonderful panel. Thank you. So now we have time to collect up a few questions. It's been a little quiet in the chat, which suggests to me that some of our regular Pogo people are not here because they're always very lively in the chat. But let's hope there's a few questions around the room. Or live questions from our online audience. I think you can put your hand up and come in that way. Yes, question at the back.
It's more of an observation, sagging on the last presentation, but I think we're noticing that there's quite a lot of optimism bias built into outcomes-based commissioning. And for me, I think I've got a question about how we need to ensure that participants to outcomes-based commissioning are made aware of the logic of outcomes-based commissioning, and therefore the importance of taking a different approach to the one that they may be more accustomed to in terms of trying to impress a commissioner. And that depending upon the nature of the impact bond, the people who should take responsibility for that may differ. So it may be the commissioner, but it also may be somebody who is hired as a performance manager or a procurement and field manager. So that may include the investors who are going out scouting for providers to work with. Also, it may need to be the responsibility for setting the tone and the expectations and the logic may need to happen at various points, especially if quite some time ago, somebody, whether an external agent or a previous person within a commissioning body or someone else, was coming up with a business case for why you should take the outcomes-based approach to a particular innovation. And then that doesn't marry up with then parties who then come in later on who've got a different view and different sets of experience to bring to that calculation. So I think the question of responsibility for making sure that people are contributing appropriately and not introducing optimism bias is something that needs probably thinking through.
Thank you. What we'll do is collect up a few questions and then give our panelists a chance to respond. Anybody else like to come in? Yeah.
I would like to ask a question about the public procurement of food. So it's great that the local farmers are included in the procurement process. But do they also have a price guarantee? Because I would assume that they're also quite vulnerable to any fluctuation in prices when it comes to actually delivering their food.
Thank you. Any others? Yeah.
Nadia, about the US homelessness issue. She talks about a new nomenclature for homelessness in the US. I'm just interested to know, A, whether there's a kind of working definition, and B, whether she's spoken to the Changing Futures team, which Val Keane is representing here today.
Thank you. Anybody else? Anybody online? No?
Yeah, there's one just came in.
There's one just come in. Okay. So there's a question in the chat, which I think everyone can see, but perhaps those of you in the room can't see it. Could you please explore how outcomes-based contracting impacts the procurement process cost and contracts cost, including contract management costs? So that might be something for people to address when we go back round. It's a great question. Thank you very much for that online question. And finally, I guess just one from me, if I may. What struck me as all of you were talking was that many of these interventions that you're discussing or advocating feel like kind of common sense things. You know, it's kind of obvious when you point it out that these would be good ideas. So I'd love it if you could say something about the barriers to implementation. What are the problems that you've come across? That what's stopping people from doing the great things that you're encouraging them to do? So maybe a little reflection on that would be helpful too. Okay, so what we're going to do now is just go background our panel in the same order, giving each of you a couple of minutes to respond to either questions that have been directed to you, some of those broader questions, or just to offer some final reflections of your own, or possibly on what someone else on the panel said. So Nadia, I can see your camera on. You get to go first.
Thank you. As you just mentioned, what is the main barrier, especially in my topic, for the governments to look beyond the housing first approach? As I had concluded, I feel like the fact that we keep calling the homeless, the people who are experiencing homelessness, and thinking that that is an issue to do with only housing, and that mindset that homelessness is only about housing, is one of the biggest barriers. The nomenclature and the language that we use, the definitions that are stuck in our mind, when in fact it is a multidimensional issue where employment can actually result in access to medical care through insurance, and where corporates can also play a role when increasingly when they are said that ESG is not just about greenwashing or the environment aspect, but also the social, what is S in it, right? So can they participate in contracts where they can partner with social enterprises who can train the people who are capable of getting an employment? And if they employ any of these people who are potentially at the risk of homelessness due to any factors, which was not just to do with lack of housing, can government incentivize them? So thinking about solutions other than building something like a house, which is so capital intensive and which can take years, and it can result in a chain of delay and bureaucratic corruption. So the way we see and way we define, I think it's a big barrier in itself. And I do know that one of you asked a question, but it was not really clear because of the echo for me. So was it a question or just a comment?
Yeah.
Basically, there's a couple of programs here in the UK that have looked at basically doing what you are describing to some extent and have met the same issue.
Okay.
So the National Lottery Community Fund ran a program called Fulfilling Lives. Sam's here from National Lottery. Could probably tell you more about that. And also the UK government runs a program called Changing Futures. And they both approach the issue by looking at the multiple and complex needs of individuals. I mean, it's just another badge, unfortunately, that gets added to solving a problem. But multiple and complex needs seems to be a working definition that lots of policymakers use in the UK.
Oh, yeah. I did read upon a couple of initiatives like a Pathfinder approach. But at the same time, the ones which you are saying is really interesting. I'll look at it. And that's exactly what I'm saying. The UK has a lot of examples, but the US is still with a housing first mindset for a long time.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, Nadia, for those concluding thoughts and for dealing with the questions. Felipe, something you'd like to add?
So I'll start with your question. Thank you so much for that. Yes, so the new regulation does include price guarantee for farmers, but it includes another, adds another complexity, which is creating local systems for price monitoring, because there is like national prices, and there's and that everyone in the country uses these sort of price standards, but it changes somehow in the regions depending on the time of the year, depending on the harvest quantity, etc. So it adds another layer of complexity, is the price guarantee. But also it adds another bit, which is the time of the payment, right? So large retailers don't have any problem when they're paid, 1 month later, 90 days later. So what this regulation also adds is upfront payment of the produce, but that also implies change of administrative structures so that can happen. So I hope that answers. And just to add to your question, I think one of the barriers for public procurement of food in Colombia is, well, it's easier to just go buy, wherever is cheaper and abundant. And it makes things easier for the government. It's less complex or less complicated. And so just adding this 30%, it implies adding lots of administrative processes, including the contracts, the prices, the quantities, and yeah, I think this is why it hasn't yet started the full implementation of this law. But thankfully, there are people who are taking the lead on this, and they are like showing the way forward.
And presumably, just in terms of the question that we've got in the online chat, that also has some quite significant cost implications. So I guess for the government, it's a question of, do you want to pay this extra money and get this great benefit or not? There's an analysis to be done there.
Yeah, definitely. And then the question is, what's the real cost of cheap food? Yeah. In the end, for me, that's a structural question.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you very much. Elizabeth.
Barriers, I think, is probably the one that we come up against a lot, and especially because we work with so many marginalised communities. Everybody has an opinion, and everybody's opinion is the one that counts at that particular point. So it's trying to juggle the multiple stakeholders, and it's invariably those who we're trying to work with and to build projects with who have the least voice, and access is the hardest. So when we've been working within the Ministry of Justice and looking as to how you create social value innovation within the prison space, we don't get to speak to prisoners very often. There's a huge amount of security issues behind that, and actually getting onto the wings and having been doing it in the COVID era. So being able to access and to hear what is relevant to those people, I think PPN 0620 and everything that came before it within the Social Value Act, it has a place, but it's then how do you put it into practice? And that's what we're all learning to grapple with. And how do you cost it? Going to what Stephen was saying, there's a cost involved to all of this, but when it's a meet, the most economically viable tender, accessible tender, how do you then cost all of that? Because what's the pound-to-pound value within that contract? So there's multiple barriers that you're faced with when you're coming up with these great ideas, and I can come up with an idea at the drop of a hat, but how do you implement them? So that's it, and it's being able to work with the stakeholders, with the commissioning clients, with everybody who's part of this community, whether they're voiceless or voiced, to try and create something that is purposeful. Because there is no point, and this is an expression that we use a lot within the military space and within justice, is that we're done to. So how do you reframe that? And that's what these government contracts are trying to do, but we're so early in that process. So it's maturing the commissioning clients, as I was saying, as well as the practitioners who work within these spaces.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. Rory, Myra, how do you want to manage the response?
Increasingly, I don't believe in the best contractor, or I don't believe that the best contractor is objectively discoverable through like a let's design this and let's run a competition, and that competition is going to be objective, and then we'll discover it for social services. I do think that procurement processes that involve more engagement, to get this, so a point that Sam I think was making about the market engagement and really understanding what the people around the room are talking about, I think is important. Processes that allow negotiations and discussions, I think are really important here. And I think the reason that I don't necessarily believe in this idea of the best contractor is because the relationship that you have with your contractor really is something that happens over time. And you could award a really great contract to somebody who did a really great proposal, and if that relationship's weak, then you're going to have a weak, the delivery on that contract is going to be weak. At the same time, I think you can exercise more discretion, have discussion, and discover like a really strong relationship that grows over time and results in really great services for the end users. So that's why I think there's something more here. But as far as the implementation goes, and the point about cost, that's harder. Like that kind of collaborative working, or that kind of market engagement, that takes work. I mean, collaborative work takes work, and that takes capacity and it takes time. And this is sort of classic case of shifting the mindset away from like procurement as an administrative function to being a much more strategic function that involves collaboration. And so it's a lot to do with how are we training our procurement people, what capacity we're giving procurement, and not treating procurement as that as this sort of function that exists in an office divorced from everything else that's going on within any contracting authority.
Thank you, Mara. Thank you. So, and you actually mentioned something interesting, because you said that many of this is it's common sense what we're bringing, and it really is. Should be actually, because but the thing is, sometimes we just realize that something is a problem after it happens. You only realize too late. So, for example, what I was talking about, engaging the legal teams early, and I'm glad you brought it as well because we're aligned. Sometimes you only realize it until it's too late, until you haven't engaged them, and then you have to go through the whole line of thought and get them on board and really go through the idea behind an outcomes-based contract. So sometimes you just realize when it's too late. For example, I faced that problem when I was working in the design of a SIB in Brazil, and Milena Castelnu, who works with us in EOF, she also mentioned that she faced similar problems when working in SIBs in Morocco and Colombia. So you can see that it is a common problem for practitioners, which is why we are really trying now to highlight and focus on that. I think that you mentioned the barriers. You asked about the barriers for implementation. On the public procurement side, what I would say that should be helpful is that public procurement should be seen as a strategic part of any social outcomes contract. And sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just seen as one more step. But so we have to shift that and really see it as a very strategic moment in creating a social outcomes contract. And also one last thing I would like to mention. So I also talked about the existence of contract templates, that it can be really helpful for awarding social outcomes contracts. But sometimes, even when there are contract templates, they're not used. So in the UK, for example, some local authorities use different contracts. So sometimes even when you have something that can be a solution, you have to really focus on it and use it, because yeah. So that would be it for me. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And back finally to Steve.
Thank you. I'll take the question on autism advice first, and then So that's a really interesting point. Yes, there is a tendency for everyone to be very, very optimistic about all these contracts. I think to a degree that's obviously very, very useful. It spurs people on, but obviously there's risks to this, right? And I think the first thing, you need to test the assumptions behind the pricing and behind the bid in general. That's a lot harder than testing an assumption around a budget, because budgets you can verify by just checking the cost of various things. Verifying prices per outcome involves testing the approach as well as the cost of intervention. But you can do that by starting with a market engagement process before the procurement process is launched. Obviously, everyone's saying to talk as much as you can, always a good thing, to understand as much as you can about the environment that you're working in before you suddenly kind of launch into this procurement system. Because often, always in procurement, you can't talk to the market during. That can be very difficult if you don't if there's a wall between you and the market during the whole process. I would say build as much as you can into the templates, into the procurement templates. And kind of our experience was making financial scoring and target templates as interactive as possible is useful in the sense that providers can input their prices scores and actually see how they're going to get paid, and seeing what the implication is of missing their targets on the payment and making that as interactive as possible. So requiring them to fill in a specific template.
Model at that point.
Yes.
And there isn't any of that at any point at the moment. Really interesting.
But I mean, we definitely found it to be useful. I think we've found a lot more engagement having done that than obviously not having done that. Often you can point out some really kind of obvious things where if people just submit a price and don't think about it, and they submit a budget separately. I mean, a really basic point is often the prices don't cover the cost of the budget, and people don't often realize that without looking at the payment function properly. And I would finally say, building it into the design of the outcomes-based contracts as well, like fundamentally, if neither you nor the market have ever done any of this before, don't be afraid to not always go down an outcomes-based approach. Use kind of input-based in year one and then see what the outcomes of that is, and then build up into an outcomes-based approach. That's another option. You don't have to fully commit yourself for 5 years to outcomes where you don't necessarily know that they're achievable. That's all I'll say on that question. On the barriers to implementation and why certain things are quite obvious but not always being done. I would start by saying in the kind of procurement world, the job of procurement officers in ministries is often not to be creative. That's a good thing, and deliberately so. You don't want procurement people getting too creative, but that often breeds a particular mindset where there's people are skeptical of new things. And unless they understand the rationale, they're also, procurement people are time pressed. They've got hundreds of bids to get through. Yours is one new thing in a pile of 50 other standard things. They don't have that much time to get super familiar with it. And so often the gut reaction can just be, no, like this is not the way we do things. Let's just do it, just follow our procedures and make everyone's life easier. So that's why starting early and making sure they understand why you're doing things before the procurement paper hits their desk and they suddenly kind of give it a red line is the way to go about that. We often have these conversations far too late, as Mara was saying. People are often outside of this sphere. I mean, another answer as to why certain obvious things aren't necessarily being done. Like, not everyone has the time to be thinking about outcomes-based contracting all day. People are busy everywhere. Often you're right. A lot of these things are common sense, and if you've got the time to think about them, you will often reach the same conclusions, and that's really good to see. But it's just about bringing people on that journey with you. And most times, a lot of people can be convinced and see the benefits of certain approaches, but it's just about giving enough space for people to understand it.
Can I make a comment?
You can make a very brief comment.
If we keep thinking about procurements as like individual contracts all the time, then we don't get the opportunity to be strategic and step back and think about the portfolio or think about the people in the place that needs to be served, and then design the spend activity of the whole organization around that. But I think every time we're thinking about like, oh, this is one bit of paper that's got to go on this person's desk and they've got to process lots of these things. I think that's where many organizations are stuck into thinking of procurement as this administrative function, and actually it could be a much more, and some places is a much more strategic function around the portfolio of spend.
Brilliant. Thank you. Okay, so we're drawing to the end of our time. There's another online question about e-learning and toolkits, and I think the GoLab website would be a good place to start. There's lots of great information there at different levels of technical detail. So I'd encourage you to go there and see what's available. Next, there is tea, and then there is a big picture session at 4 o'clock. The work never stops. How do we make social change stick? Lessons from outcomes-based partnerships and beyond, which sounds both timely and topical, and also very interesting indeed. So before you run off for refreshment and head on to that session, let me thank our panel, Nadia online, and our panelists in the room for being very, very interesting and very well behaved as well, which is always lovely when you're chairing. So thank you to you, thank you to our online audience for your thoughts and comments, and thank you to everyone in the room for attending. Thank you very much.